So I didn't tag this video with spoilers because I really wanted to talk about this game and some of its ideas with people who haven't played it yet, but I also want to dig into this game's theme, so there will be a spoilery section, but I'll give plenty of warning before we get there. Anyways, you know what's in vogue in horror these days? Callbacks to 80s horror films. And not the popular ones of the era, either. Does anyone else think that's weird? Slasher films like Nightmare on Elm Street and Friday the 13th were the bread and butter of the 80s horror scene the way the Saw and Paranormal Activity films are today, but we mostly left the slasher genre disassembled in the 90s in the wake of postmodern meta-films about them like Wes Craven's New Nightmare, Scream, and even lesser fare like I Know What You Did Last Summer. Instead, what seems to have become popular here in 2017 about 80s horror is a sort of synthwave fever dream that cherry-picks the parts of the 80s it likes or finds stylish. A sort of mishmashy soup of Stephen King fonts, John Carpenter music, and a smidge of Steven Spielberg's believably written children that form the basis of things like The Void, It, Stranger Things, and It Follows. Also popular, at least around Halloween season, horror anthologies. You see them pop up all the time in other media. Collections of H.P. Lovecraft's or Edgar Allan Poe's work, anthology TV series like The Twilight Zone or Outer Limits, pulp comics like Tales from the Crypt, or even films like Creepshow or VHS or Trick or Treat. But you don't see a lot of proper horror anthologies in games, and all of that is part of what makes today's game, Stories Untold, interesting. It's a collection of 4 short horror adventure games unified by some common underlying tones and themes, all wrapped up in a package that is decidedly driven by this neo-80s horror/suspense renaissance. The idea is that each episode tells a story, and each story involves a person sitting at a desk in front of a piece of technology they have to interact with in some way. Manipulating these devices form the basic puzzles that form the backbone of each story's interaction. For example, the first game is a straight-up old-school text adventure where you walk from room to room by typing things like "Enter Kitchen" or "Go Upstairs." The next episode has you performing questionable medical experiments using radiation to examine something in a containment unit that doesn't seem quite dead. Another story finds you snowed in at a research station in Greenland, translating radio messages using microfilm reference materials and inputting the resulting codes into a computer for reasons that you're not entirely clear about. But it sounds ominous. And this is where the 80s nostalgia really helps sell the game. For films and TV, this fad has been almost entirely driven by cinematic aesthetics, how a world looks, sounds, and feels on film. There's a collection of 80s movies and shows they're either building on, paying homage to, or if you're feeling grumpy, ripping off. But video games don't really have a visual aesthetic tradition that goes back that far other than pixel art. So the nostalgia bent here leans more mechanical. These games are set in the 80s maybe in part to scratch a nostalgia itch or engage with a popular fad, but also in order to justify arcane medical experimentation equipment, microfilm machines, and someone getting genuinely excited by a text adventure waiting for them at home. It's trying to give you a sense of technology that is more tactile and more analog, right down to miking your keystrokes even though you're actually playing on a real keyboard. And it works in part because it's nostalgic, especially if you're old enough to have interacted with some of that tech, but also because it's largely alien. Computers and microfilm and radio and mechanical equipment all still exist, but not like they did back then, and this game captures a clunky, dials and knobs, just barely digital version of them that feels at once quaint, and yet somehow foreign and creepy in 2017. The changes in the devices keep the gameplay fresh from story to story, but they also allow for a mostly consistent tone. These stories are tense, methodological explorations of a given mechanic, and what engaging with that mechanic really means as the story unfolds around you doing your menial task, i.e. playing the adventure game is cute fun until you open the door to a house in the adventure game and actually hear a door downstairs creak open in the world you're playing the game in. Or how performing experiments on a science sample might be more distressing if that sample were still alive. Or how translating cryptic messages for the government is fun until you start to realize what those messages might imply about the rest of the world. They're deeply unsettling stories that work in tandem with the tasks the game asks you to accomplish.
No reaction from first stage. Let's try high frequency.
That said, it manages to be super spooky without any real proper jump scares. I mean, there's some small stuff. A light might short out, for example, while you're sitting at your desk. But there's not really a scene in any of these stories where you're shifting from one terminal to another, and suddenly there's a big ugly monster staring you in the face and screaming. But you're always expecting it, and that's maybe why it works. It's actually relatively reserved when it comes to showing the goods. It leaves as much to your imagination as it can, which is part of why it functions so well both as a horror game and as an ode to old-school adventure titles. It's actually a really clever merger of mechanic and genre. Take a game genre that encourages players to imagine a world by presenting it only in bits and pieces, then use subtle clues to get them to imagine a world that is horrible, twisted, or terrifying all around them. And that works so much better than just showing a monster. I mean, when we covered Amnesia, A Machine for Pigs on Spoiler Warning, we were able to get the monster to give us a piggyback ride, and at that point the tension is kind of cut. I also really dig the tone, which manages to be pulpy without falling into outright camp. That is, it's aware that it's a spooky game out to scare you, and it's not averse to using some tricks to get you into a spooky mindset, but it never does so in a way that plants its tongue in its cheek or rolls its eyes at its own absurdity. Don't get me wrong, I can appreciate a good piece of camp when the mood's right, but it wouldn't have worked well with this material. Like, it would have tipped it over into a parody of the recent 80s horror trend, but by avoiding camp, it has an earnestness about it that feels era appropriate. Really, if you dig the whole 80s revival in horror and like a good scary game but don't like jump scares, I generally recommend Stories Untold. I don't know if it quite sticks the landing in the final episode, but it's a solid effort and a good spooky time if you're looking for something to play around Halloween. As for why the fourth story doesn't quite stick the landing, well, I guess it's time for spoilers, so yeah, there'll be spoilers from here on out. So the big reveal gets hinted at the end of the third story, where we break with the established mechanics and are suddenly free to walk around a 3D environment. During this trek outside, you constantly expect to see aliens or zombies or whatever it is that is eating the world alive, as you maybe send missiles to counteract them, but they never show. Instead, the world slowly stops making sense around you. The characters speaking to you over the radio begin behaving in fundamentally different ways, and you see two cars just sitting there in the Antarctic snow.
I'm so tired.
And then when you finally get back to your station, it is suddenly the room from the first story of the game, and cut to black. Then you start episode 4, which opens by revealing that Stories Untold is, in the universe of the game itself, an 80s TV sci-fi thriller like The Outer Limits or Twilight Zone. We then cut to what amounts to an extended exposition dump that explains what quote-unquote really happened, and also explains every machine you had to interact with. Long story short, James Asian was a kid who just turned 18 and was about to travel to America to school. To celebrate, his parents held a large birthday/going-away party. His father gifted him a big bottle of fancy scotch, and he ended up drinking most of it before his sister asked to be taken home. On the way, James crashes into another car belonging to an off-duty cop, killing him.
James, for fuck's sake, pull over! James!
Seeing police lights coming his way, James puts the scotch bottle next to the police officer in an attempt to frame him. Then, after waking up in the hospital, he finds his sister has also died from her injuries, and his parents no longer wish to see him.
We did the best we could. I'm so sorry.
Where is she? Let me see her.
Please, Mrs. Asian, take a seat.
I don't want to take a seat. Let me talk to her. Now.
I'll arrange for you to see her. In the meantime, James is in recovery. He's stable for now.
I don't want to see him.
Subsequently, each of the game's previous chapters gets cast in a different light as the result of this information. We find that the House Abandoned chapter was about two versions of his return home. One where he gets home and happily finds his childhood adventure game waiting for him as a gift from his father up in his room, and one where he arrives home to an abandoned version of his house that doesn't want him there. The fact that you're effectively stalking yourself becomes a metaphor for guilt. There's almost a dissociative element. There's you, and then there's this monstrous version of you control that does what you say, but despite that, it comes for you. Like, the you that ruined your life isn't really you, but it is. Does that make sense? And the weird alien autopsy in episode 2 becomes the hospital's attempts to keep you alive, framing the post-car crash James as, in effect, alien and otherworldly. You perform a sort of vivisection on yourself. Again, guilt and a dissociation from self seem to be a core theme here. You are playing the part of James that is repulsed by his actions, convinced that the thing that stares back at you, the guilty, monstrous thing the doctors had to keep alive, wasn't really you. James cannot fathom his culpability in what he's done. We also discover that the alien orbs are camera eyes, staring back at you, judging you, showing you your true self even if you don't want to hear it, even if you can't hear it. They become a manifestation of your guilt. They show up at the end as soon as the cameras turn on, and soon enough you hear your sister's voice damning you from them.
You went headfirst into that officer and you wrecked all of our lives. And then you couldn't even take responsibility.
Finally, there's the station process in episode 3, which I think is cool tonally, but makes maybe the least amount of actual sense. You see your police report on microfilm, which is, I guess, where the microfilm machine comes into your dreams, and it's mentioned that your family were playing number games with you, which is, I guess, where the mapping of the frequencies bit comes from.
Your family would do number puzzles with you. Anything, really, to bring you back.
But your family also abandoned you after your sister died, so who was playing games with you when? It's a little ambiguous. Regardless, the vague sense of the world going away and the vague sense of apocalyptica fit with what is effectively the end of the life James knew. It mirrors well a sense of hopelessness and abandonment and the deafening silence James faces left only to his own thoughts. So it's not like this twist doesn't work on some level. The recontextualizing of the previous episodes makes sense. Each story is about how James is dealing with his guilt. The problem is that James never really deals with his guilt, he's just masking it. Jamesation is only able to remotely process what he's done by framing it in terms of pop culture, bad 80s horror anthology TV shows, and old school text adventures and the like.
I think that's enough of that for now. You're quite fond of this show, aren't you?
He never owns what he did. He never takes responsibility for it. He never processes it. He's running from it. And even at the end of the game, he's continuing to run from it. And I think maybe the fundamental problem Stories Untold has here is that framing guilt as horror fundamentally prevents one from processing those emotions. I mean, Dear Esther deals with the grief and ambiguity of guilt after a drunk driving accident.
I drag Donnelly's corpse on my back across these rocks, and all I hear are his whispers of guilt, his reminders, his burnt letters, his neatly folded clothes. He tells me I was not drunk at all.
And it even has some light horror elements, like the ghosts off in the distance that you might not even notice are watching you. But the focus is on grief and guilt, with the horror aspect as a sort of quiet reminder of your sins. Stories Untold focuses on the horror of your sins, but never about how you confront or acknowledge guilt, only how you mask it with synthwave intro sequences and stylish reinterpretations of classic text adventures. And I get it, it's a horror game, and the dude who did a horrific thing is being punished by his mind accordingly, like a postmodern take on The Telltale Heart. The robot eyes that symbolize guilt haunting you more or less confess to being responsible for this when they're introduced.
It's like a conscious black box. It can show you its memories. Look into it. The visions will translate onto the screen to be something that you can understand, that you can play out.
But I have to confess I liked the other stories better when they really were just part of an anthology of spooky tales, a series of short games that didn't feel obligated to explain everything, but just sold you on a sense of dread. I liked the haunted house and the alien autopsy and the frostbitten, unseen, implied zombie apocalypse for what they were. Knowing that they're all part of some cop-framing, sister-killing drunk driver's fantasy to escape the reality of what he's done lessens them. Still, like I said, I like Stories Untold on the whole. It's 3 great horror tales and one that maybe doesn't quite work so well for me, but it's still a nice spooky Halloween game, and I'd love to see more horror anthologies like this one.